I would get emails from people in war zones or in disaster zones saying, hey, I have a lot of dead bodies, how can I sell them? And I got those emails probably about 6 times after the red market came out. All I've seen is an increasing desire to have to increase the supply of human flesh and bones across the world. And if you can't stomach where it comes from, then why can you stomach where it ends up? I've seen him manipulate scientific results in his own editorial processes, where he's had bad science published that is obviously bad, but he gets it published in journals that he's on the editorial board for. Never trust anyone who sells supplements.
Hello， 大家好，欢迎收听脆皮兄弟播客，我是主持人老博。我们今天请到的嘉宾是一位来自美国的著作傍身的作家、调查记者兼人类学家 Scott Carney。我们主要会讨论2个方面大的一个内容。第一部分大的内容呢，是跟这位专家过往的一些经验经历有关。他过去主要在南亚地区，在印度，追踪报道一些关于非法人体交易、关于器官买卖、关于倒卖人体骨骼的一个全球性的产业链，做很多相关的这种报道。那除了这个以外呢，我们第二的一个部分就是，近年来令他更为着迷，就他更为关注的一个话题。当然，也有可能比这种，所谓的非法人体交易。更加危险，就离我们普通人更近的一个话题，也就是所谓的打引号的健康网红。那这个健康网红跟他们日益增长的这种影响力，这么说吧，就是我们指的这种健康网红里面呢，其实首当其冲的就是近些年来在整个英文媒体世界里面爆红的一个斯坦福大学的一个神经科学教授，叫 Dr. Andrew Huberman。那其实顺便一提哈，就是在中文的社媒里面，我们也经常看到各种各样的这种营销号在搬运推广 Andrew Huberman 这些人的视频内容。虽然我个人会觉得这个里面可能一方面它没有很好的这种版权意识，没有一个版权归属的一个很明确的一个东西。那第二一点，我也会觉得说它没有融入这些搬运者本身自己对这个话题这内容的思考或者解读。那这样的话，其实就会有许多带有缺乏科学共识的，尤其是像 Andrew Huberman 近些年，尤其是今年吧，他的花边新闻也很多，然后他还这个一会儿 Scott Carney 也会提到说他有一些被别人指责学术不端的一些行为。那如果越来越多的营销号在推这人的这个内容，你懂吧？就是一个老外坐在那儿讲，然后就觉得他是一个大专家，然后斯坦福的名头到哪儿也很好使，对吧？就大家可能就信了，就会有很多这样的内容进入到中文社交媒体的圈子里面来，进入到中文观众的这个视野当中。那除了像 Huberman， 我跟 Carney 也会在本期播客中分享我们对于别的一些，尤其是长寿抗衰这个赛道里面的一些网红，像 Peter Attia， 还有包括最近在国内注册了小红书账号的这个 Bryan Johnson， 我们也会分享发表一下我们对这些人的一些看法。那如果你喜欢我们的内容，记得点赞分享订阅我们的频道，感谢大家收听，谢谢。
Hey Scott, great to have you here. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, and I've actually been reading your book, The Red Market, which is also published in Chinese 2 years ago, and I have to say it's really eye-opening. The way you've dive into these tough topics with such a clear narrative really pulled me in, and it's made me think about a lot of these issues in new ways. But before we dive into the heavy topics, how's everything going on your end? You've been working on some pretty awesome stuff, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've been, in the last year, I've moved mostly over to YouTube. So now, I've written 7 books, and
yeah.
And at this point, I think I'm maybe done with books for a little while, and I've gone mostly online. So I've been, putting a lot of the research that I used to do into sort of more video formats. It should be, easier for people to get into,
consume,
and consume. Yeah.
Right. That sounds like a lot to juggle.
It's way too much to juggle. I'm working on 4 stories right now as I talk to you, and it's filling my brain with madness. Like on one minute I'm looking at like financial statements, and the next minute I'm trying to get criminals to talk to me. It's crazy.
Wow. Well, yeah, I can imagine it's been busy. You've covered so much ground in your career, from body part trafficking to health gurus and so on. So it happens that I'm gonna attempt to dig into both two sides of your experience today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so, but first, apparently, there's a recent bone trafficking case where I live in China, involving thousands of skeletons stolen from crematoriums for the past 8 years. And I think the amounts to hundreds of millions worth of bone graft materials. And of course, this case is still currently in court and hasn't been fully resolved yet because it's still under judicial review. I think we might not be able to go into too much detail or draw any conclusions. The investigation and trial are ongoing and things could still evolve. But while hearing about this case, sitting in Denver, have you ever had one of those moments like, oh, great, here we go again?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, the question is, do I have the time to actually investigate these things? Because there's morgue thefts that happen in the United States all the time as well. Most recently, one of the morticians at Harvard Medical School was sending body parts out to some guy in Pennsylvania. Like we had a morgue theft that happened in Colorado a few years ago where the FBI got involved. The thing is that there aren't not just enough journalists going out there and covering this stuff because there's not enough. There's just not enough journalists in the world to do all this. So I have not been following up on every single case because honestly, this market is just
Right.
too big to keep a handle on.
How about what is the red market, exactly? Because it's a term you coined in your first book, I think. And what are the distinctions between black markets or gray markets, with the
Sure.
red market?
Yeah, so when I conceived of that term, right, we have this obviously the white market, which is the normal legal commerce that happens in a regulated way in the world. Then there are black markets, which is the illegal stuff, right? The graft, the criminal enterprises, which happen because it's trying not to be that main market. And then you have these gray markets, which are sort of in between. The reason why red markets are different is because they deal with the ineffable value of human lives, right? Where we're
Yeah.
dealing with actual human tissue, where actual, your body right here is what you live through. And when you start buying and selling pieces of it, you actually are making your literal flesh into a unit of economics. And so I feel like when we talk about biological systems, buying human pieces, literally pieces of humans, you're engaging in a different type of commerce. And that's why the red market term has been so prevalent. Like when I put it out, it was the title of my book, but now we're seeing it appear in academic literature. It's being cited all over the world as yet. Red markets are fundamentally different because they are you and me, literally.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's dial it back a little bit because I'm curious, how did you learn so much about the red markets in the first place?
So I was living in India as a foreign correspondent for American publications, and there's a couple starting points, but one of the sort of obvious ones is I was living there right after this tsunami. I think it was the 2004 2005 tsunami, and all these people ended up in refugee camps, and the refugee camps were literally only about 3 miles from my house. All of a sudden I discovered, because the local media reported it, that like all of the women in one village had sold their kidneys. And I was like, oh my God, this is a big story. And so I went there. I was with Wired magazine and with National Geographic. And, you just had hundreds of women who'd sold their kidneys to these sort of major hospital enterprises. And that sort of got me, I'd already been writing about commercial markets and clinical trials and things like that before, but this was such a huge event that it really sort of put me down that road of really looking to kidneys. I also wrote a big story on the human skeleton trade out of India, where until about 1980, So maybe from about 1840 to 1980, most of the skeletons that were available in medical schools around the world came from two sources: either robbing graves locally, or they were sold from they were exported out of India. And the city of Calcutta, on sort of the eastern side of India, was exporting 60,000 skeletons every year. And so I looked into that, and I found that even though the trade was made illegal in India, I think it was in 80. So I think it was somewhere between 1980 and 1984. It was no longer legal to export human bodies out of India, because they found a guy who had sold 1,500 child skeletons, and the only way to get child skeletons in that volume was to execute children, to actually kill living people for that. And that really started a movement in India being like, we have to stop the skeleton trade. What I found in 2007 was that even though the trade had shrunk, the demand for human skeletons had not gone away, because doctors still need to study on bones. And I found that, lo and behold, they were still exporting human skeletons out of India. So I exposed that, and then there were just many other stories, as you read in my book,
Yeah.
Market. Let's see if I have the Chinese version here. Is this it?
Yeah.
Look at that.
It's this one. This one.
Oh wait, that's not it. Okay.
It's fine. I have a copy on my own here. It
Okay,
was
great.
published 2 years ago in China, and yeah. So when I read about your story, like in the opening chapters, you were saying that you were attending graduate school for anthropology, and
Yes.
you were on your way to get your PhD. I'm curious because I'm probably the same age as you are when you made the big transition. What made you pursue journalism?
There were a couple reasons for that. There were personal and sort of more like professional reasons. On the professional side, the reason I got into anthropology is because I wanted to ask big questions about what it means to be human. I had studied medical anthropology, I'd studied cultural anthropology, and I was interested in big questions, largely in South Asia. I speak Hindi. I sort of lived in India for a long period of time. And then I realized at some point, the draw for anthropology is sort of to go around the world and investigate interesting people and interesting stories. And I thought that anthropology was a great way to do that. And it turns out that academia is not the dream that I had of it. You're not going to be Indiana Jones when you're in academia. Instead, you're going to be writing very, very long and boring papers that 5 people are able to read, and then those 5 people will judge you for all time. I felt like if I started writing for the mainstream media, I could ask the same questions, but I could do it for a mass audience. And so that was one reason that I left, the PhD circle. So I dropped out when I was getting like at the dissertation level. That's all. I just had to complete the dissertation, but instead I wrote a book. The name's The Red Market, and now you have read the book, so it looks like
Yeah,
I made the right decision. Um,
I agree.
and there were also personal reasons. Like I at one point at the end of my career, I started leading abroad programs in India, and we were going through North India. And then at one point, one of my students, while we were on a meditation retreat, I was the program director, not the meditation teacher, but on the program, on this 7-day silent meditation retreat, one of my students took her own life, and on the retreat, because she thought that she was enlightened. And I had her journal, and that question, when people meditate, at least especially Westerners, I don't know how meditation's viewed in China, but Westerners have this idea that you can get like magical superpowers. Like if you meditate, maybe you do kung fu or something, you'll become a Shaolin monk. You'll become you'll have these sort of like, grand powers, and they actually seek those powers in meditation. And when you do that, sometimes I've never met somebody who had superpowers, but I have met people who went crazy looking for superpowers. And that's what happened with my student. She believed that she had become a bodhisattva, which is sort of like an angel. And then she took her life believing that all she had to do was leave her body and then become, this sort of superhuman. And that was a problem, right? Because that wasn't
That's crazy.
That wasn't spiritual transcendence. That was insanity, and it was started by her spiritual journey. Right? It was started by that spiritual yearning. And then then I traveled around India and I asked people, well, was she? I would ask monks in Tibet and in North India. I'd be like, well, was she enlightened? And they would be like, no, she wasn't enlightened. She was crazy. And the other part of that is seeing a person going from alive to dead, being responsible for them. I was also sort of made aware of how, right now you and I are in control of our bodies, right? We're in control of the flesh of our bodies. You have to wash it, you have to maintain it, you have to eat healthy, whatever. But as soon as you're dead, all of that material becomes an object that the state has a role in, the police have a role in, insurance companies, airlines. All of a sudden, these commercial interests have an interest in your literal flesh, and that was really interesting to see. And it led right into this red market work where I saw people like treating living bodies as commodities.
In your transition from anthropology, from becoming an academic to journalism, did your academic background ever change the way you approach these investigative stories compared to other journalists?
I know for me, my anthropology background is very valuable in the way I frame questions. I'm generally don't just do an investigation just to do the investigation. I want to ask bigger questions about why, if I'm looking at a criminal enterprise, I don't want to know, I don't want to be like, hey, that guy's a bad guy. What I want to do is say, hey, why did this economic system arise and how was it perpetuated? And what does that mean for the way we practice commerce in general? So I try to elevate the questions that I work on, because I'm not so interested in the true crime genre. I don't want to be like, some lady was murdered and it was really bad, and like that those details don't fascinate me as much as like why. What are the economic disparities that led to this situation appearing, which makes me actually a lot less commercially viable. I should just be, it bleeds, it leads, and go with that because I'll get a lot more views. But that's not really what interests me. In terms of what other journalists do, I think there's just so many great journalists out there. I think a lot of people, a lot of them are really honorable and really dedicated and ethical. And there's also just a lot of schlock. So how who is out there, and it's a lot of people like to paint all journalism as just like one monolith. Like all journalists think like this, all journalists think like that. But that's not really what it is. It's we are people working within big media industries, and we have all our own motivations. And there's always a negotiation between the writer and their background and what those institutions want. And I have been really, really happy with my transition over to YouTube because I no longer have to deal with the people who are, who used to be above me and used to tell me what I had to do, or at least, approve what I had to do. Now I can just do it and then go on to the next thing.
That's awesome. What are the parallels or differences between this case in China? I'm sure you've read about that. What are the parallels between this case and other bone thefts or bone trades you've investigated before?
Well, there was another very, in about 2000, I want to say 8 or 9, a major investigative organization in America, and I think it might have been the Pulitzer Center, but I'll have to check that for you. Investigated skin and bone grafts to the international market within the United States and Eastern Europe. And they found that there was a tremendous amount, usually being robbed from mortuaries, that would be, you get a freshly dead person. See, the advantage of skin and bones is that you can harvest them for longer than you can, say, a beating heart or a kidney, because those organs, deteriorate very fast. With skin and bones, you have a little bit more time to harvest the material before it can be useful in the transplantation market. So there were really just large-scale black market trades in bone grafts and human skin. that happened, between the United States and Eastern Europe. It doesn't surprise me at all that you see the same thing going on in China, and it probably happens in every other country where there is a demand for human materials. It's just sort of the way it works. We live in a world now where we want excellent medical treatment, right? When you're sick,
Right.
and you need a bone graft. I don't know what condition you might need a bone graft for, but like you need one, and you're like, hey, I have a broken leg that will not heal if I get a bone graft. You don't care. Generally the patient doesn't care where that bone graft comes from. You think you're buying a service. You go to a doctor, and the doctor will provide you with the treatment to fix your problem. But the doctor has a problem if the only thing that they can give you to cure that condition that you have is from a human material. They need to find a source for that material. And oftentimes we don't have great, the willed body donations don't always provide enough. And there's ethical problems even with that. And the doctor and the other people in that supply chain realize they can make a lot of money, because if the bone graft, I don't know what it cost, what an installation costs, but let's say it costs $10,000, it might be $100,000 to get that surgery. There's a lot of economic incentive to go find it. At the same time, you can find, when you go to a mortuary and you see you've got 100 dead people coming in a week, well, that's a lot of opportunity to harvest body parts that maybe the family doesn't want to give up.
Well, first of all, I think I agree with you totally that illegal markets for body parts aren't confined to one country or one culture. They seem to pop up wherever there's scarcity, lack of regulation, or people just being desperate. And but the more important question is, how do you as an investigative journalist talk about this issue in a way that avoids the very common pitfalls like blaming political systems or specific groups, because throughout the years, I've been an international student in the States for many years, and I've seen many double standard or sensational titles produced by mainstream media in the West that are, let's say, terribly good at pointing fingers, like it's all communist fault, or shit gets crazy in third world countries, without maybe not realizing that the same could be happening to them. I mean, sure. So my question is, how do you avoid the common pitfalls while still addressing the
Well, I just think you have to look at what's actually
greed?
going on. Like you don't put an ideology on top of it. I mean, I am not
Right.
at all surprised that you have a large bone graft scandal going on in China, because it's also happened in the United States. It's also happened in Eastern Europe. These are
Right.
economic issues that have to do with the laws of supply and demand, and then people willing to bend their ethics to meet that. Now, I am not actually very familiar with the bone story that you're specifically talking about
Right.
in China, because I didn't personally investigate it. I only have read some news
Sure.
articles. What I will say that this is a problem with capitalism. It's a problem with human nature, and it's a problem with profits, where profits override ethics, and that is an international problem. It happens in every country where there is opportunity, where there are humans in charge of the system. I really don't know if the government of China was involved with this bone graft story, if it was just private hospitals, or if it was, or who it was. Like, it could have been any of that, right? I don't trust anyone on the basis of their reputation. But you need to get the facts. You need to collect the facts. So you need to report the facts. It's as simple as that. And since you are in China, you are in a much better position to look at the facts than I am in Denver, Colorado, who does not speak Chinese.
Yeah, I agree. But Scott, I've been a corporate consultant for quite a while now. I get hired by big oil companies and various energy conglomerates, both locally and abroad, to help them improve their business. what's interesting though is that in all my years, we almost never, believe it or not, we almost never encounter any ethical dilemmas. Excluding the whole issue around, the climate change maybe. But
which is a bit of an ethical dilemma.
Yeah.
Like that's a big dilemma, my friend.
Right. Yes, but for me, there's no whistleblower information that could make for a headline or investigation. That said, I'm not exactly well versed in topics like the ones you cover. Illegal markets, trafficking, health grifters, etc. But I do find them fascinating. I have to ask, when you're out there investigating these deep, sometimes dark parts of society, do you find that to be ethical? The ethical lines, do they get blurry? How do you approach those moral gray areas when you are in the field? Because you have to deal with like criminals, you have to talk those, you even have to develop those informants to build up a story, right?
It's always hard. I feel like I end up in ethical gray areas all the time, and you have to just sort of deal with it on a case by case basis, because the problems are never exactly the same, because it's about human relationships. One thing that I consistently have to remind myself is that I am not, you have to develop rapport with somebody. If I'm interviewing a mob boss who killed someone, I have to go ask them, why'd you kill that dude, right? Like I need to get that information because I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to get information. To ask that question effectively, I need to first think to myself, why does this person think that they are a good person? And I have to speak to that. So the question isn't like, why did you kill that guy? But like, why was it necessary to kill that guy? Why is what you do an invaluable service to the world? Like, I have to get into their mind a little bit. But my duty is to my audience. My duty is to the truth, is to put the truth out there and explain what's happening in a larger context. So to a degree, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it duplicity. I ask them honest questions. They know I'm a reporter, but I'm not public relations. Like I'm not there to like save their reputation. I'm trying to get them to tell me what really happened, and that's tricky. That's an interpersonal relationship. But then what I put in my article has to be, it has to line up with what they say. Like I can't misuse their words, right? I can't just take a little short clip and make it mean something it didn't. I need to do my best to convey what they actually said, and I need to place it in the right context. And so that's a pretty, that's just the art of journalism, and there's no one way to do it right. You just sort of have to feel your way through. But I also get other things that happen to me. Like for instance, after the red market came out, every time a natural disaster hit in anywhere in the world, really, I would get, or like a riot or major war effort, I would get emails from people in war zones or in disaster zones saying, hey, I have a lot of dead bodies. How can I sell them? And I got those emails probably about 6 times after the red market came out. And that's one, I will not help those people. Like ethically, I will not help those people. On the other hand, if I'd wanted to, I could, instead of being a journalist, I could have been the world's most profitable organ broker in the world. I think I could have made millions selling body parts. But I have chosen the more ethical route.
Yeah, because do you think the awareness of red markets has increased globally since the release of your book, The Red Market? But has that awareness led to any noticeable changes or crackdowns?
So the one obvious change that I can attribute to my book actually has to do with human surrogacy. So at the time I was writing, a lot of foreigners, so this would be a lot of Americans, Europeans, Chinese, Koreans, people would fly to India to implant an Indian woman with an egg, and the woman would carry it to term, and then the child would be exported out of the country. After the red market came out, that trade in India became illegal. So it's no longer legal. It's still legal to do in vitro fertilization and surrogacy within India among Indians, but it's no longer legal for foreigners to come into India and do that. Now, so that's a small victory, but the trade just moved to Cambodia. So it didn't really change the global scene. I would say in general, I mean, a book is just a book, right? It's just a bunch of words on a page. It doesn't necessitate changes. It's not like like Obama read it and was like, "Oh my God, I have to stop red markets." That did not happen, right? It was what happened instead was, occasionally gets mentioned on the floor of the U.S. Congress. Occasionally, someone mentions it, but to actually change these things requires requires leadership at the levels of power that I don't participate in.
I understand. So now, here's the $1 million question. Literally, because apparently bones have been quite the commodity. For one thing, I didn't know bones could be so valuable before. Just forget crypto. So I'm gonna check my family trees for lost skeletons. I'm sorry that was dark, but for real though, Scott. Here's where it gets tricky. On one hand, and you also mentioned that there's this undeniable medical need for materials like bone grafts, let alone organs. These can save people, save lives, or improve the quality of life for patients. And you also said that bone grafts, especially allogeneic bone grafts. I looked it up. By definition, these are bone tissues transplanted from a donor of the same species, but genetically different from the recipient. So typically harvested from cadaveric donors and processed in bone banks. They're commonly used in orthopedic, dental, and many other procedures to promote bone healing and regeneration. And I've asked my dentist, my doctor friends, they say that allogeneic bones are far superior to other artificial materials for its biocompatibility with recipients. And in many cases, you can't do autogeneic transplants on people because it may leave them with other morbidities. But on the other hand, we're talking about human parts, human remains even. There's a deep cultural and ethical significance to how we treat the deceased. So how do we balance that need for life-saving materials with the demand for respecting human dignity?
Well, that is the $1 million question, because that is the entire subject of the red market. It's hard to separate out the ineffable value of human life on the supply or the recipient side. Now, what I did very intentionally in the red market is I didn't want to tell the side of the story of the recipient, because we know that story. Right? We know the story of the person who needs something and gets that thing. Like, that's a story. That is the story of capitalism, right? The question is like, where does it come from? And if you can't stomach where it comes from, then why can you stomach where it ends up? And that's the problem. And you're right, it is a cultural thing. If we lived in a culture where you're like, our bodies don't matter, and I don't care about it, and it's a-okay to grind me up and turn me into sausage, then then cool. Then the market on the other end is totally fine, because you don't have any value in the human body. But if instead we live in a world where we care about human bodies, we care about the bodies of our deceased loved ones, and there's no guarantee that we do, but let's just say we do, then we should not live in a world where we build a system that forces us to turn those bodies into sausage, right? So this is a cultural conversation that needs to happen. I will say, though, that if we have a country that says that bodies don't matter whatsoever, like they espouse a religion that's like, who cares about bodies? Every other country in the world will go buy their bodies. Like, that is a growth market for sure. I would be surprised, however, if your mother died and you were excited by the fact that you could make $500 selling her corpse to the bone graft industry. I think that you might feel weird about that. I could be wrong, right? Maybe you're okay with that, but if you're not okay with that, then you actually have to take a stand on how we source things.
今天的播客节目由小五健康管理赞助播出。不良的生活习惯和营养过剩是肥胖、二型糖和非酒精性肝炎等慢性代谢问题的主要原因，尤其在中国，这些问题正在给许多家庭和社会带来沉重负担。然而，除了药物和手术治疗，改变生活方式已被证实可以预防和管理这些疾病，甚至在很多情况下逆转它们。事实上，全球范围内许多顶尖的医疗机构已经纷纷开始采用数字疗法，在生活方式的层面进行干预，作为慢病管理的首选方案。但现在，网络上关于营养的信息五花八门，自相矛盾，使人感到困惑。各种锻炼方法层出不穷，难以选择适合自己的方式。这时，专业健康管理团队的介入和帮助变得尤为关键。想了解更多，欢迎微信搜索小五健康助手小程序，在小五健康助手小程序或 APP 咨询客服了解方案，在聊天窗口输入脆皮兄弟4个字，可以限时获得免费健康管理体验方案，包括免费的健康评估和定制饮食计划。小五健康团队由资深医师、营养师和健康管理专家组成，他们利用小五健康 APP 和微信小程序提供个性化、价格亲民的1对1饮食和锻炼方案，帮助患者持续优化生活方式，改善身体指标。如果您和您的亲友想了解更多，开始健康管理之旅，请微信搜索小五健康助手小程序，或在应用商城下载小五健康 APP， 大小的小12345的5，小五健康助手。
Okay, right, but I'm gonna play devil's advocate for a moment here. So, from a purely utilitarian perspective, some people might argue that, look, man, these bones are just decomposing in the ground. Well, technically they don't decompose, but they're just lying there. They don't serve any purpose there, right? So sure. if a tibia from the grave can be turned into something that saves or improves another person's life, then why not use it? Aren't we wasting potential resources? How do you respond to that kind of logic?
Well, that's just capitalism, right? You're just saying the general capitalism thing. Like, for instance, if I am an American shoemaker and I make shoes, and I'm like, well, there's poor people in Bangladesh who will work themselves to death for no money whatsoever, or for $1 an hour or whatever the going rate is. I should be able to exploit them. Well, we do that, right? We do that, and we also say sometimes it's bad, right? Sometimes it's bad to do that, and so we should be able to make ethical ideas. Now, here's another question, though. Let's just flip that on its other side. How much are you, Bo, willing to sell me your kidney right now?
Why would I do that?
Yeah.
That's a tough question,
And how about not your kidney? How about
question.
a one lung? How much is a one lung? You have two. I just want one of your lungs.
Oh my God. I think I get it. Yeah.
Because this is the thing with bodies. Now, you, Bo, you're affluent. You live in you have, you're educated. You have all these values, and you are not unwilling to part with a lung because you're like, look, I like my lung. There's no amount of money I want to give up for my lung, even though I could live with only one lung.
Yes,
but
exactly.
If you're willing to say instead, I need a lung, therefore I should be able to use my money to go buy one from a poor person. Well, that's just you using your money to do an ethically unsavory thing. Why is it that billionaires don't give kidneys ever? Like, why is it that the rich are like, no? It's because human body parts flow upward through the social hierarchy, not down. And this is why the human body should not be a commodity.
And in your book, you wrote about the idea of a transparent supply chain. And I know that was a long time ago, but does it mean that, what does it mean? And why is it important for putting a stop to red markets? Because are we turning bones or these organs into commodities if they can be openly traded? I haven't fully understand that.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I don't know how the laws work in China, but in the United States we
Mm-hmm.
have something called HIPAA, which is medical privacy. So that
Mm-hmm.
you know, your employer in America can't send a note to your doctor to be like, "How was your cancer diagnosis?" That's just not legal in America. You can't move health information around like that. And there very well could be something like that in China as well. Now, the problem is that ethic, which might be good for an employer-employee relationship, is really weird when we talk about selling and moving body parts between people. Because if I'm a hospital and I can provide you a kidney for because you have a kidney failure, and then you never know and you cannot know where that kidney came from, that is an excellent cover for hiding all sorts of crimes. It could be that the hospital is doing it very ethically with all of the right, all of the right regulations and all of the right, rubber stamps on the things. It could
Mm-hmm.
also be that they are lying. And what we
Mm-hmm.
see a lot in, this is what I uncovered extensively in India in the kidney trade there. The hospitals would
Mm-hmm.
just use this idea of like, oh no, you can't know where this came from, and then they would fake all the paperwork. So what we
Mm-hmm.
need to do, in my belief, is we need to change the way we even think about bodies in these markets, and we need to identify where everything came from. We need to say, look, you didn't get blood, you got Bo's blood. You didn't get a kidney, you got Sarah's kidney. You didn't, and I think that we need to make that very open and 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 identifiable in every instance, because it's so easy to make a crime happen. It's so easy to say, look, here's our lies. And I will say it won't stop fraud from happening. People will still fake paperwork, but it will
Mm-hmm.
give you the ability to check the paperwork. Because right now, what happens, you go to a hospital and you suspect there's an organ ring going on, and then you're like, oh, no, it's all ethical, we promise. And then that's it. That's the end of the conversation. We need to have a system where it's just totally open. If you want to live in a world where you should be able to get kidneys on demand, you have a kidney failure, you want to get your kidney, you should know, and in fact, everyone should know where that kidney came from. And that's how we solve the red market problem. Because if it turns out that all of these people, too many people are getting bones from one graveyard in I don't know, in Calcutta, well, maybe we should look at what's going on in Calcutta. It would give us the clues to look at that and then
Mm-hmm.
address it as a
Right.
society.
Right. So have you seen any successful examples or of regulation or policy changes in certain countries that you think could serve as a model for the rest? You've talked about Iran in your book, but upon closer look, you also mentioned that theirs aren't really working either.
Yeah, no, I've never seen this work well anywhere in the world. I mean, I think
Okay.
that I think that in America, like a lot of this has to do with your trust in the system. Like if you think that the medical system is ethical, and let's say you could, in theory, have a non-transparent system that runs ethically. If the doctors are all upright and are all moral, and everyone is a good person, then you'll run a good system. Like because the people are ultimately the problem. Um, I don't like blind trust as a journalist. I don't just trust you just because you say you're a good person. I've met too many liars, and it's sort of like what Ronald Reagan said in the Cold War: trust but verify. And we just have ignored the verification thing. And the red market. I wrote the book in 2011, and we're in
Yeah.
2024 now. It's only gotten
Mm-hmm.
worse. Like capitalism, the whole idea of trading money for body parts, and we found more and more uses for body parts. So, and everyone wants to have that utilitarian question that you asked: how will we save lives? They say, how will this improve the lives of hundreds of people if I can get there? If let's say one femur or one tibia can create 20 bone grafts, right? That's great. We saved 20 people, and then they just wave their hands and say there's no ethical problems in the supply chain because it's private. And I don't think that there's any, I've seen no legislation, no even desire from any institution to make these things public. All I've seen is an increasing desire to have to increase the supply of human flesh and bones across the world.
I want to bring some sense of reassurance to know what can be done or is being implemented, but because I don't want our audience to feel unnecessarily anxious walking away from this episode, but from your perspective,
then you're talking to the wrong guy, Bo. You're talking to the wrong guy.
Right. So yeah, so like based on what you just said, so there isn't a silver bullet to this issue, and it's just more of a whack-a-mole situation, right?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the bone market, for instance, like in America, it has not only hit poor people, right? There's a very famous case of a TV news presenter. His name was Alistair Cook. He was an anchor on the news programs. Everyone knew him in America. His femur was stolen in a mortuary. And if it can happen to the rich and powerful, it can happen to anybody who goes to a mortuary, because this is the problem with mortuaries, is that once you're dead, you go behind the door and then you just have to blindly trust the guy who's preparing the body or the woman who's preparing the body. And you have to trust that they don't have financial motives that could supply a market. And there's no way to do that. There's no amount of money you could pay a mortician for them to say, sure, it's not worth it for me to sell this if they're already selling body parts. So I don't think it's very common, I will say. It's not, you run the risk every day of getting hit by a car, right? That's a much worse risk for you. I'd much rather have my femur stolen after I'm dead than get hit by a car tomorrow. So, I mean, I think that we can weigh this in terms of like the actual harms that it might do us. But to say that it couldn't affect anybody is a lie. These systems, once they start operating, they can absolutely operate on you, because your body right now is in your control. But the moment you're dead, you don't control your body anymore. And the moment a door closes, your loved ones aren't in control of it anymore either.
Well, are there any grassroots level or community level initiatives that are making a difference in combating these issues?
No. There are not. There are none in the world that are operating currently. There was a group out of Berkeley called, anyway, it's dead. It's gone. What was it called? Oregon Now or something like that. The only ones that are operating in America right now are ones that are trying to make the market more commercial. And there's a lot of people trying to solve the kidney shortage in America and the blood plasma shortage by putting more money into the system and making it legal to buy and sell human body parts. And by saying, you put you go in and you willingly say, I will give this stuff up. There's a fair number of those initiatives around the world, but none of them are talking about transparency. Transparency is just not on the radar, and every single one of those initiatives will fuel more illegal activity, in my mind.
Okay. So we've talked about this being a global issue, but when it comes to cooperation or cross borders, things could get a lot trickier. What role do you think, if there's any chance of international collaboration, what role would that play in combating these body part trafficking, or are we just stuck here, things staying the same?
You raise a very important point, is that when you cross borders, it becomes much more difficult to prosecute criminal activity. Right now, I would imagine that China and the United States have some sort of cooperation in relation to Interpol for international criminals, right? Where you can extradite someone who did a big crime. But to do that requires a tremendous amount of bureaucracy and will on both governments. It's really hard to get two governments to cooperate. on anything, really. And effectively what happens is that people will fly from America to China or to India or Egypt or whatever and buy an organ and then fly back to their home country. And then if a crime happened, there is zero will to investigate that. It just becomes so monumentally difficult to do that in the first place that it's just not done. Or at least, or if it is done, it's done once in a very splashy investigation. For instance, there was one that happened in Brooklyn between Israel and the United States, where a rabbi was involved in buying and selling human organs. That did get prosecuted. You know, he says he did hundreds of these transplants, and he was only convicted for 3 of them. So the will is actually very, very low for this, and to actually make that work, I mean, you're really talking about an effective global police institution. And that just raises so many other problems that I'm not even going to go.
Right.
Let's fix our domestic markets first.
Yeah,
and then let's worry about like an Uber police force that can do things right in every country.
Makes sense. How about, because now, Scott, let's pivot to a different kind of issue, you know, one that involves fewer crematoriums and more podcasting, okay? Because like there's a person called Andrew Huberman. He has become the go-to guy for making science sound cool. But what do you think? Because you are now definitely one of the increasing number of people who challenge and actively undermine his popular podcast career and his commercial success, I guess. But yeah, let me do a little bit of backstory on Huberman just for context, in case some of our Chinese-speaking audience who might not be as familiar with Dr. Huberman. Sure. So Andrew Huberman, he is a neuroscientist from Stanford. He rose to fame largely through his podcast Huberman Lab, where he breaks down complex topics like stress, sleep, and neuroplasticity in ways that are, let's say, bite-sized for the average listener. Well, maybe not exactly bite-sized because his episodes are hours long, but still, his work has attracted millions of subscribers, and that's only for YouTube. But as people say, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. So Scott, I'd like to start by acknowledging your recent appearance with Dr. Mike. You know, I know the conversation didn't unfold as you both intended, and it was, you know, it veered into some unexpected territory that wasn't necessarily reflective of your work or intentions. I understand that things can happen, and sometimes public perception doesn't always capture the full picture. But with that said, though, like Dr. Mike has done some incredible work in debunking health misinformation, and the way he runs his production, the way he approaches content is truly impressive. And I believe him to be best of the bunch. However, I believe that conversation wasn't entirely fair for you, and I love to give you the space today to share your perspective without the distractions that might have shifted the frame before. So maybe we can begin with how you and Dr. Huberman first connected, and we'll go from there, because I'm really curious how did you become friends with him in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I wrote a book called What Doesn't Kill Us, which was a New York Times bestseller. I think it's actually available in China as well. And it's about ice bathing. It's about why we should jump into ice water and make our bodies awesome from ice water. And there's a lot of science in it. And there's also, you know, some places where the science stops and we just don't have the information. So I talked about that rise of this community of ice bathers and what my own personal experience is with it. When that book came out, it was a huge success, a global success. And Andrew started sending me emails. He was a neuroscientist at Stanford. He was not famous at that point. He was just another one of many scientists I correspond with. And I went out to, you know, we started a friendship, and I included some of his insights in a book, a follow-up book that I called The Wedge. And we were, friendly for about, I'd say, 3 or 4 years. But there were some weird things with his personality that I noticed immediately, where he got very angry very quickly. He seemed very manipulative, and whatever. Like, he was a guy that I couldn't totally trust. But whatever, he was still a neuroscientist. He was still at Stanford, still a big deal. And then this magazine article, a reporter named Carrie Howley at New York Magazine, investigative reporter, wrote to me and was telling me about a number of sexual, like a sex scandal that was going on with Andrew Huberman, where he was cheating on a bunch of women, telling them he was all going to marry them all. And then it was a salacious thing. But when she wrote to me, I had noticed things with his personality, and I talked about like how I thought that he was an intensely manipulative person, and how since he got famous, right? I knew him before he was famous, and I had these feelings. But one of the things that after he got famous, I noticed playing out in his public persona as well, is that he didn't really stick to the science, right? He is a very smart guy. His research is on ocular, like transmission of light into your brain through the optic nerve. And he's really, really good at that. He's one of the world experts on this one very narrow field. And I was interested in that for my book, The Wedge, because he said some really interesting things that were useful for me talking about how the body interacts with the environment. However, the Huberman podcast, he suddenly became a global expert on every issue. And none of us are experts on everything. And he would issue these protocols. He would say, like, if you do these 3 things, you will, have a much better health experience. And it would be supplements, it would be light exposure, cold exposure, heat exposure. And all of the scientists who were experts in those individual fields would be like, whoa, you are way off, dude. You don't know what you're talking about. You read 2 papers and then you expounded on that, which, the funny thing is, it's like this rise of bro science in the world. Like, it's this rise of sort of like not very good science. And what I saw in his personality is that I had seen him be very manipulative in interpersonal relationships, both manipulating those women who all came forward. And there are at this point, I think there's 13 or 14 women who are all talking about how he was running simultaneous relationships and, manipulating them. And he did some weird things with me as well. And then I realized that he's doing it to his audience. He really likes giving people instructions and giving people protocols, even if I think he likes it, and this is a personality assessment by me on him. I think he likes it because he likes control. And I think that's an insight that I have from knowing him, is that he likes to control the people around him. And he, it's weird. It's a weird thing once you actually know him and you have felt him manipulate you, and then see him do this to a mass audience. And he doesn't really care all that much about the underlying science of it all. He just wants to tell you what sounds good. And it's lightly papered. I've seen him manipulate scientific results in his own editorial processes, where he's had bad science published that's obviously bad, but he gets it published in journals that he's on the editorial board for. And, and for instance, you can look at my video on Susanna Soberg if you want to look at exactly what I'm talking about. But essentially, she was saying that ice bathing makes her awesome, and it doesn't only make her awesome, it makes her 600 times more awesome than any other scientist had shown. And then he saw this paper. He was on the editorial board of a journal. He got that paper published on the cover of the journal. And then the day after it came out, he had her on his podcast. And then the podcast blew up because it was an impossible result that played into a narrative of superhuman powers through this easy protocol that he can offer. And it's weird to see the manipulation of the scientific process for popularity in the social media sphere. And, I do think that he says a lot of things that are correct. Like when I look at Huberman, I say he's about 80% right in general. In general, he's a smart guy. He is a scientist. He gets a lot of stuff. He's about 80% right. But that 20% of outright lies or just misunderstandings, however you want to think about it,
Could
He's
be
actually
both.
very dangerous because he's so respectable, because so many people put their trust in him. And if I give you 20% lies and 80% truth and you believed everything I said, that means you are believing 20% lies.
Right.
And then he creates protocols around that now you live your life by it. It's really, I don't know. I don't think he's the worst actor on the internet by any means, but I do think you have to be very cautious with him.
I agree, and it's also interesting that you mentioned, and I think there's a line between making science accessible and watering it down too much. Where exactly do we draw that line? Because I'm seeing more and more people, credentialed or not, respectable or not, these people are popping up these days. Not just in America, in China too. And I sometimes find it difficult to tell a grifter from a genuine good place to learn about science and health information. And I'm confused.
Well, Bo, I have to tell you, I'm confused too, because the thing is that these people start out oftentimes with something really good about them. Like, I really do think there's a lot of really good information that Andrew Huberman puts out in the world, and a lot of these other people, they have a truth and they wrap it in a lie at some point. And I think there's a sort of a trend where if you're starting out, you have something very genuine to say, and you put it out there, you put it on your podcast, your video channel, whatever, and people, and they respond to it. People are like, wow, this is amazing stuff. And it doesn't matter the topic. It's just the amazing stuff you put out. And then you have to put out a second podcast. And then you have to put out a third podcast. And then you're on podcast 100 and you're done with the stuff that's actual special. Like you don't know everything anymore because you are an expert in a small field. And then as your audience gets bigger, the demand for you to talk about everything as the expert doesn't go away. And it's sort of a trend on the way social media works, is that if someone gets very famous, almost inevitably, if they present themselves as an expert the whole time, and that's maybe the critical point. If you always present yourself as the expert, you are lying, and it's just the nature of being a human. And they don't. And then another thing that we can see, if people sell you a product, that's another thing you have to worry about, right? And Huberman, he will tell you, I'm giving you zero cost information. This is zero. I'm trying to make this accessible to the government, the public. And honestly, almost everything is zero cost on YouTube. Like, you don't have to pay on YouTube for anything. So everyone is zero cost. It doesn't say anything. But if we follow the money, if we actually look at where his money comes, he promotes Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens is a supplement that costs about $100. It costs about $3 to make, and they spend 50% of their budget on marketing. Andrew Huberman makes about $20 million a year selling Athletic Greens. That's a lot of incentive for him to tell you that Athletic Greens is a magical supplement that you should buy. And if you look on his page, you look at the other sponsors that he lists, or listen to his podcast and see, all of those sponsors are people who have given him money because they want him to sell product. And he is going to tailor his message to the products that he sells. So in general, it's the same problem with the red market. Capitalism comes in, dilutes the message, and tells you what you want to hear. And I really think we need a better business model on the internet, because once you start...
because I think health influencers like Huberman, they now have massive platforms, and their advice can impact how people live their daily lives. And is there a responsibility that comes with this level of influence? Can we just regulate them in a way? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't think so, because I also don't want the government to come in and tell me what I can and can't say. So of course, it has to do with the education. It has to do with the syndication. Like, I mean, there's an algorithm component to this too. Like, if I put out a video, the algorithm doesn't show it to 100 million people automatically. It does that with Andrew. Andrew puts out a video and 100 million people will see it automatically. So there's something about the way that information travels through the internet, which we probably have to talk to tech companies about what a fair algorithm looks like. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not a tech guy. I don't know what.
Do you think platforms like YouTube and social media should bear more responsibility in regulating this content shared by health influencers?
They're trying. I mean, if you see a video and there's misinformation in the video, like a COVID-19 conspiracy theory, they'll put like a tag under that being like, here's health information. I think they're trying. I think it's very hard because remember, YouTube and every other social media service is trying to get you to engage and to get clicks, right? And to not only click one video, but click the next video and click the next video. That's their business model. It has nothing to do with the accuracy of information, right? That's the accuracy is the externality. They're like, they make money first through views. And then they're like, well, maybe we should cut back on this or that. And I think it's very hard for them to really create an ethical algorithm. There used to be a mainstream media and the mainstream media has lots of problems. Let's just preface, mainstream media is messed up in 100 ways. But one of the ways that it wasn't messed up was that when it existed, it had a lot of money. And then there were ethical standards with fact checking, with legal review, editorial insight, and institutional support, meaning that if I'm a journalist, I come in as a young reporter, I'm being mentored by other reporters who are above me, and they're sort of like giving you social cues for how to be a good journalist. There's nothing like that for influencers. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Like, where in journalism, you weren't allowed to take money at all, ever from a source. And on the internet now, you get applauded when you get a sponsor. You're like, oh my God, you got a sponsor, congratulations. Well, all you're doing is selling out. And, I had this conversation with Andrew at one point. I wrote a tweet that said, never trust anyone who sells supplements, which is a very good rule. Never trust anyone who sells. And then he called me up on my phone like 10 minutes after I tweeted. It was like, you don't mean that about me, do you? And I'm like, yeah, I did. I meant that about you. I meant that about everyone who sells supplements. It's not like you don't trust anyone who sells supplements except Andrew Huberman. No, if you sell supplements, you're probably a grifter. Right, you're probably someone out there who's has magical thinking and is making money on a product that probably doesn't do anything because it's poorly regulated, at least in the United States.
Right.
And then he also told me, he's like, I never take money from sponsors. And then he said, well, I took an ice bath the other day. So like they gave him an ice bath and they gave him equity in the company. Well, of course that's going to make him want to promote his ice bath company because it gets him money. And because he's a neuroscientist, he doesn't have any ethical training in journalism. He hasn't actually come up through the journalism ranks. So he never got any ethical insights in how to be an influencer. And now he's one of the biggest influencers in the world. Now, again, the mainstream media has lots of problems, but it did have a mentorship component to it. And now we see influencers who just come up and they're mentored by the algorithm. They're mentored by their supporters who really just want fame for fame's sake. And it's a real problem. I don't know how we solve it. I don't take sponsorships on my channel. I'm not totally against the idea. I think that people should have a way to make money on the internet because the mainstream media is also dying. It's basically dead at this point. So there does need to be a viable business model, but there also needs to be like a code of ethics that people stick to. And I don't know exactly how that works. For me, what I do is I have a Patreon. I make money from YouTube ads, but I also just don't make much money. Like my goal is not to make $20 million. My goal is not to scale up my channel so I have 50 people working for me. My goal is just to do what I do. And I think other people have different relationships with money.
Yes, but I've always wondered, when a health influence advice becomes a brand or becomes intertwined with sponsorship or other brands, how do they still stay credible? I'm talking about health influencer 2.0. So how do we make health influencers better That would be the question.
Well, maybe we need to stop having influencers. Like,
Okay,
I,
right.
I mean, the way you can tell the rule of thumb is if they're selling a product on top of their influencing, they're probably influenced themselves, right? They're probably, and I don't know how bad it gets because it's going to be on a case by case basis. But basically, if someone is saying, here's my podcast on diabetes, I do a whole podcast on diabetes. I talk about the biology of diabetes and like sugar intake, and I give you all these charts and whatever. And at the end of that, I tell you this supplement or this pill or this device that I have or this e-course that I sell, you pay me money and then you will solve your problem. Well, that person's a liar and you should unsubscribe.
So at what point do endorsements and sponsorships blur the line between genuine science and just another product to sell? And that could be tricky sometimes, I think.
Yeah, never trust a person who sells a device, a product, or anything who's giving you health influence. I mean, I wish there was
Okay.
I mean, in theory, they could have no conflict of interest. In theory, it could be done where someone would be a totally legit person. But I don't think we give them the benefit of the doubt. Like, I don't think that you say, of course you're an okay person because I like you. Yeah, I like your persona. I like how you talk. Well, fine, you can be charismatic, but let's, if we actually follow the money, what's actually happening? And as the rule of thumb, if they're selling something, they're probably compromised at some point or the other. The other thing that you can do, and what I do, is I often will look into criminal records. I will look into information about their past, and I will try to understand their character. That's not their public-facing persona, which is why I think that Huberman's background with his infidelity and the lying that he done, the manipulation that he does, I think that informs. If you think that somebody would lie and cheat in their personal life and not think they do it in their public life, you are making a statement of faith that is not backed up. And if you think that someone making a lot of money is not influenced by the lot of money that they make, you are making a statement of faith that may not be backed up. You mentioned Dr. Mike. He makes a tremendous amount of money. He does occasionally support products. And I think that my experience with him, he's been really, really ethical. Like, he seems like he really thinks about ethics. He really tries to give not sensational advice. And I think that in general, I really do trust him on the sort of the general information. I think he also makes mistakes. He made a mistake in our interview where we were talking about the placebo effect, and I've had subsequent conversations with him. It doesn't mean he was a bad person for making a mistake. It just means sometimes people make mistakes.
Right.
But I also think that he could go wrong. Like, if all of a sudden next week, Dr. Mike is selling you a soda that increases your erectile function, be wary of Dr. Mike. I mean, he's not doing that right now, but like, at no point is someone always good. Like, I feel like I'm being a very ethical person in general in what I do. I mean, you can look at my finances because I post them on YouTube. And you can see how little money I make doing this. I'm not, at the very least, I am not getting rich doing this. So that is something in my favor. Eventually I might, right? Eventually I might be making $100,000 a month. And then you could be like, then maybe reassess and think, is Scott still an okay person?
Follow the money.
I might be an okay person still, but I think that you still need to think about that in relation to what I'm saying. And it's never a point that someone is good once and is always good after that, because people change over time.
So before we wrap up, what do you think about the rise of personalized medicine? Because I can think of people like Peter Attia. He's talking about medicine 3.0, and he's a big proponent of that. Do you see it as a positive trend in science, or are we also entering a gray area where influencers might exploit it for profit?
Yeah, so Medicine 3.0 by Attia is basically Star Trek medicine. It's the idea. Let me back up a little bit. In general, Peter Attia gives great medical advice. It's fairly conservative.
Right.
In general, Peter Attia is fine in his medical advice, but he still has financial relationships, which are very questionable. I would say that the idea that functional medicine, and that's really what you're talking about with Medicine 3.0, the idea that you can test all of your biological levels, and that by testing them, we understand how that will make you a healthier person in the future. More testing is not always better for you, though. Like we don't know how everything fits together in the body. We might be able to identify levels, how they might change, different metabolites, different proteins, different hormones. We might be able to measure them, but we do not, as a rule, understand what those measurements mean outside of a narrow range. Like we know if your blood sugar is really high, that's bad because of diabetes. And we have that sort of really pretty well figured out. But we don't know if your blood sugar is high right after eating an apple, if that's really bad for you. And I feel like this idea that we can test you to make you healthier. Well, then, so let's say we run 50 levels on you, and then you give that to a doctor, and then they just have a lot of information, and it doesn't mean that they have diagnostic information for how the future will unfold. We're just not there with medicine. Could we be in the future, in the Star Trek future? Maybe, but we're not there now, and they're selling you a product that says that they are. Like, look at Bryan Johnson. Bryan Johnson, I call him the wellness vampire.
Right.
He's a guy who does everything. His motto is "Don't die," and part of me respects the fact that he's the guinea pig for himself. Like he goes out there, he tries things.
He's a volunteer lab rat.
Lab rat, pays for it more or less out of his own pocket, and so part of me is like, cool. If you want to do that to yourself, that's fine. On the other hand, is it working? Is testing yourself for everything, doing random cutting edge protocols all the time? How do we know that's actually making him look healthier? Well, I mean, if you just look at him, I'm actually the same age as Bryan Johnson, where he's I think he might be he might be 1 year younger than me. If you put a photo of my face next to him, personally, I think I do better. I mean, he looks like a vampire, and I look like a human who's 46 years old. And he says he's 20 years old. Well, he does not look 20. So there's a lot of like aspirational statements that he makes, but there are not a lot of results that I'm like, oh yeah, this is for real. It's basically a grift. It's basically saying, especially if he does sell these Don't Die conferences. He's involved with cryptocurrency.
Blueprint.
He's involved with a olive oil that literally is called snake oil, which in English, of course, means
it's very funny.
Bad, right? It's funny, but it's also like, wait, but are you selling snake oil? Like, are you actually just lying? Or are you actually, I don't think he's lying. Are you actually selling an idea of human health that does not actually exist yet? And I believe he is.
I think.
And when we had people doing this in the 80s, I remember there was a guy in the 80s who was, saying he could lengthen his telomeres with every fucking supplement in the world that he would take, and somehow that would like make him super healthy. He didn't last long. Look at Aubrey de Grey. He was doing that too in the early 2000s. Like we get these people. Charles Atlas did this in the 20s. We get these people who have protocols that they promise will work, and then they die normal human lives, because that's what happens. Is that we have not yet figured out the I also don't want to die. I also want to live a long, healthy life. And at the end of my life, I want to, as Attia says, I want to square the curve. I want to be fine, and then I want to die quickly. Everyone wants that. Just because you identify a problem doesn't mean you have the solution. And I think that's the bait and switch that's going on with a lot of these health influencers.
Right. I mean, I think, to their credit, people like Peter Attia or Bryan Johnson, I think they are both incredibly well-informed, and I think they're meticulous about the science behind it. Like Peter Attia, I think he's someone who really dives deep into data, whether it's about longevity, metabolic health, or preventive medicine. I think I've personally benefited from his content tremendously. But what I also think, I often recommend people like Peter Attia, and I recommend his podcast to my friends and colleagues. But I also try to warn them to be cautious, because I think he's often discussing emerging research, things that are in the experimental phase or still being tested. He doesn't necessarily endorse things like NMN or metformin. I mean, yeah, he kind of does, but he surely talks about them like all the time, while maybe his intentions are good and he's careful with the data. And the problem is that not all of the audience may fully grasp how preliminary.
I want to question why we believe that cutting edge medicine is better medicine than proven medicine. This is actually
right.
We often want the next generation of treatments. We often say, like, if I have cancer, I don't want the cancer drug that people have been using for 20 years. I want the next cancer drug that will be the best one. Like, everyone wants that. But it's a logical fallacy to assume that the next one that's currently experimental, and we don't know how it actually works, it's a logical fallacy to think that will work better than what we have right now. And I would like people to look at the fact that we have medicines that work, that are, there's always problems. Like, if you take a chemotherapy drug, it's going to make you feel horrible, right? It's not good. It's poison in your body, but it does work at a statistical level better than anything else we have. I also would like a chemotherapy that doesn't have side effects, but we don't have it. And that's the problem, is it's we believe that we have medicine 3.0 when it doesn't actually exist. So when Attia goes out and talks about NMN or metformin or rapamycin or any of these things as like, hey, this science is interesting. Sure, interesting, but it doesn't mean you should do it. It doesn't mean that anyone should do it, because it's untested. And all they're doing is selling you the belief of and the understanding of a problem that we have identified. We don't want to die. We want to live a healthy life. And then they say there's products that are trying to address it. That does not mean those products work. And this is a huge problem in the world. We think that we're getting educated by these people. We think that they're telling us how the future should work. And we're learning something about the underlying biology, but we're not learning that. What we're learning is a statement of faith in how we want it to work. If you really want good medical advice, talk to a doctor who's treating people currently. That's much, much more important. And indeed, a normal patient physical from your normal doctor is much more likely to catch a disease that's afflicting you than anything you might do from a podcast.
So lastly, let's talk about scientific consensus, because sometimes influencers like Huberman, maybe David Sinclair would be a much more suitable example for this topic. And you also posted recently that you also wanted people to fact check fact check your content that are debunking the grifters. I thought it was really interesting. But do you think it would be a good idea for emerging health trends that lack full scientific backing? For this kind of content, should influencers be required to disclose the level of consensus behind their claims?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea in theory, but I think in practice it wouldn't work, because what is the scientific consensus it's not like a thing. It's not like there's one institution, like the FDA identifies what the scientific consensus is and gives a rating to it, so that then we have a standard to measure things against. That would be great if there was something like that everyone agreed is objectively, this is what the scientific consensus is. The reality is that the consensus is always moving. It's always changing. It's like amorphous, and you can have disagreements within the scientific consensus. I will say that anytime that a podcaster comes out and says the scientific consensus says this, they don't know, because it's just not a thing. And I would love some sort of standard that we could identify, but it's just not there. And that gray area is what gives all of these health influencers the ability to go out there and tell them that they are the scientific consensus. But what you're seeing with the influencers, what you're seeing is fame, and you're seeing charisma. You're not seeing the bench scientist who isn't going for venture capital, who isn't making a lot of money for talking. You're not seeing the university researcher who's worked 40 years on one topic, one small question. They do not have the platform. So the problem is the platform, and the impetus for a famous person to perpetuate their platform, to keep on building it, and to keep on making money doing their business of influencing. So as the average consumer, it's very, very difficult, because everything we see online tells us to keep on being online. But maybe the problem is being online.
Maybe like when people like Andrew Huberman, they promote ideas that may not have full backing from medical community yet, because stuff like NMN, NAD plus, or metformin, resveratrol, this kind of stuff, I think they belong to the cutting edge category. That I hope volunteer lab rats like Bryan Johnson can try for the rest of us. And I personally think it would be a bad idea to letting these people enjoying their platform and spreading this information before there's solid scientific consensus around them, I think.
I agree. I mean, we just don't know what we don't know. And if you just mentioned 4 different chemicals.
Yeah.
There is statistically 0% chance that all 4 are the miracle drugs that they're acclaimed. Statistically, right? Like it's just not gonna be like that. And so let's say 1 out of those 4 is a miracle. Well, that'd be great, but then what if you chose the other 2? Like and the reality is like if a drug company is testing a chemical, they'll test thousands, maybe tens of thousands of chemicals before they find a candidate that works in mice. And then they ramp it up to humans, and then they find that like only 1 out of 100 of those works. And
there's a hierarchy of studies.
Right, a hierarchy, and even in humans, you might get 12 humans who respond, which is great, and you can actually on 12 humans, I think you can make a reasonable therapy on that, but you still don't know how that will affect the large population of thousands of humans. Let's say 4% of people die with X drug. Okay, and that's a very high death rate, but like 4% die. Well, if you only tested on 12 people, you might not have rung up that 4% in that, right? Yeah, there's a good
that's
chance.
Statistics.
Right, it's just the way math works, and when you ramp it up to these huger groups, you're taking a risk, and this is why we need more boring medicine and less exciting medicine. We need to be more like you should eat well, get good mental health, sleep well, and listen to your doctor's general basic advice. That's really the best we can do right now. We don't when we get to Star Trek, then we'll have Star Trek. But until then,
Right.
the guidelines that have been established and are practiced routinely at hospitals are unfortunately the best we have for evidence-based medicine. Now, I will say that you can go a little beyond that. You can say, hey, I'm going to try this supplement, knowing that it may not work, right? Knowing that it could be placebo effect, knowing that it might kill me. And if you go in with your eyes open to that, to be like, I'm going to try this, but it might kill me, or it might lead to other bad side effects, and you really understand that, you're actually beyond the science, that's maybe not that bad because you're making an informed risk for yourself. And I think personally, I take a lot of ice baths. I take a lot of saunas. The science around that is okay. It's like solid B plus science that ice baths and saunas are probably pretty good for you, probably won't hurt you too much. And I've personally had anecdotally a lot of benefits from it. I will not go out and say this will cure anything. I will not go out and say, I will say, look, I may have had a good result. And you might have a good result too. I don't think that's necessarily the worst thing, but it's when you start making claims of certainty, or just real, or when you're financially linked to pushing this message. I think that there are problems, and we just need reasonable assessments of we need to know when we've gone beyond the science, and I think that is not being presented very often. And then when you're somebody who has a very large profile, like Huberman, so I have 80,000 followers on YouTube. He has, I think, 3 million followers, 5 million followers on YouTube, something like that. I think you need to be proportionally more careful as you get more and more famous. Like, Bo, I don't know how many followers you have on YouTube. Let's say you have.
I'm just starting out my channel. I haven't posted anything yet.
Okay. So you have 0 followers. So
0.
Damage that you can do is much less than what the damage that Huberman could do by saying misinformation. And I think that there's the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And as you get more famous, you have to be more and more careful, which is why people go after these top influencers and point out their flaws, is because when they open their mouths, they influence a lot more people. And maybe we need to think about proportionality when we start talking about credibility.
So, Scott, it's been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. And honestly, I'm going to be thinking about these topics for a while because, yeah, you've given me a lot to chew on. But on a lighter note, any interesting new places or adventures on your horizon? I mean, you've been to some pretty awesome locations in your career, but I'm curious if there's anywhere you've been that really surprised you recently.
I haven't actually done any interesting travel in the last year. I went to Mexico City for a month. That was great. I'll be going
I've been there too. It's awesome.
Yeah, I'll be going to the country of Georgia in a month. I think they have great food, and I'm so excited for that. But no, I don't have any real adventures that I can share at the moment. But I really appreciate you sitting and talking with me, and I want to wish you the best of luck with your channel going forward.
Thank you. All right. Well, I love to keep this going, but it's 12 a.m. where I live, and I've completely messed up my circadian rhythm.
Okay. Well, get your sleep. Be sure your Oura ring gives you a good score. And until next time, thanks a lot.
Right. Thanks again, Scott, for your time and insights. I'm really looking forward to your next project, and I'm sure our listeners will be too. And take care and stay in touch.
Will do.